The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in September of 1878, and Tabitha Lansing knew, before opening it, that her world was about to shatter into pieces too small to ever put back together. She stood in the parlor of her father's Grand Mercantile in Fort Bridger, Wyoming, her fingers trembling as she broke the seal and read the words that confirmed her worst fears. Her father was dead, the bank had foreclosed on everything, and she had exactly 1 week to vacate the premises before they sold it all to cover his debts. The room spun around her as she sank into the velvet chair that had been her mother's favorite, the telegram fluttering from her nerveless fingers to land on the imported Persian rug. Her father, Marcus Lansing, had been the most successful merchant in 3 territories, a man who had built an empire from nothing but determination and shrewd business sense. He had left 2 months ago for San Francisco to finalize what he called the deal of a lifetime, assuring Tabitha that when he returned, they would be wealthier than she could imagine. Instead, he had gambled everything on a shipping venture that went down in a storm off the coast, taking not only the cargo, but also every cent he had borrowed against the business. Tabitha was 22 years old, unmarried by choice because she had been helping her father run the business since her mother died 5 years earlier. And now she found herself utterly alone with nothing but the clothes on her back and a crushing realization that she had been living a lie. The fine dresses in her wardrobe, the crystal chandeliers overhead, the mahogany furniture shipped all the way from Boston, none of it had ever truly belonged to them. Her father had been living on credit and promises, building a house of cards that had finally collapsed. The banker arrived that afternoon with 2 clerks and began making an inventory of everything in the building. Mr. Pemberton was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, and no sympathy in his pale eyes as he walked through the store, marking down items on his clipboard while Tabitha stood frozen in the center of the main floor, watching strangers calculate the worth of her entire life. "You understand, Miss Lansing, this is nothing personal," Pemberton said, not looking at her as he examined a display of fine china. "Your father signed the papers. The bank has every legal right to recoup its losses. Where am I supposed to go?" Tabitha heard herself ask, her voice sounding hollow and distant to her own ears. Pemberton finally glanced at her, adjusting his spectacles. "I am sure you have family somewhere. Women of your station usually do. Perhaps an aunt or a cousin who might take you in until you find suitable employment or a husband." The casual way he dismissed her entire existence made something hot and angry flare in Tabitha's chest, cutting through the numbness. She had no family. Her mother had been an only child, and her father's brother had died in the war. There was no one, nothing, nowhere to go. But she would be damned if she let this bloodless banker see her cry. "I will be out by the end of the week," she said, lifting her chin and meeting his gaze with as much dignity as she could summon. She spent the next 3 days in a haze, sorting through her belongings and realizing with growing horror that she could keep almost nothing. The bank was taking the building, the inventory, the furniture, everything down to the silver spoons in the kitchen. She was allowed her personal clothing and a single trunk to carry it in, plus whatever money she had on her person. The leather purse hidden in her dresser drawer contained exactly $47.30, her personal savings from the small allowance her father had given her over the years. It was not enough to live on for more than a few weeks, certainly not enough to start over somewhere new. Tabitha sat on her bed on the 3rd night, surrounded by half-packed belongings, and allowed herself to cry for the first time since receiving the telegram. She cried for her father, for the future she had imagined, for the security that had been stripped away so suddenly. She cried until her throat was raw and her eyes were swollen, and then she dried her tears and made herself think practically about survival. She could take a position as a governess, perhaps, or a teacher if any of the small towns needed one. She could work in a hotel or a boarding house. The options for a respectable, unmarried woman were limited, but they existed. She just needed to find a place that would take her without references, without a history, without questions about why a merchant's daughter was suddenly destitute and alone. On Thursday morning, she packed her trunk with her most practical dresses, her mother's jewelry box which contained only costume pieces since her father had apparently sold anything of real value months ago, a few books, and a daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day. Everything else would stay behind for the bank to sell. She arranged for the trunk to be transported to the boarding house on the edge of town, the only place she could afford for a few nights while she figured out her next move, and then she walked through the mercantile one final time. The store was empty of people but still full of goods, waiting for the auction that would happen the following week. Tabitha trailed her fingers along the counter where she had spent countless hours helping customers, measuring fabric, weighing flour, making change from the brass register. She had been happy here, or at least she had thought she was. Now she wondered if happiness built on debt and delusion could ever have been real. She was locking the front door for the last time when a hand touched her elbow, making her jump. She turned to find Marshall Davies standing behind her, his weathered face creased with concern. "Miss Lansing, I heard about your troubles," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "I wanted you to know that if there is anything the town can do to help, you only need to ask." Tabitha managed a trembling smile. "Thank you, Marshall. I appreciate the sentiment, but I think this is something I need to handle on my own. Where will you go?" It was the question she had been avoiding, the one that kept her awake at night with her heart pounding and her mind racing through impossible scenarios. She had no answer, but she could not admit that to the marshal, could not bear to see pity in his eyes. "I have prospects in Cheyenne," she lied smoothly. "A family friend who might have a position for me." The marshal did not look convinced, but he was too polite to call her a liar to her face. "Well, if those prospects do not work out, you remember what I said. Fort Bridger takes care of its own." Except she was not Fort Bridger's own anymore, Tabitha thought as she walked away from the mercantile for the last time. She was nobody's, belonging nowhere, with nothing to her name but a trunk of clothes and a fading hope that she could somehow survive what came next. The boarding house was run by a widow named Mrs. Carmichael, who had known Tabitha's mother years ago. She gave Tabitha a small room under the eaves and did not ask too many questions about why a merchant's daughter was suddenly living in her establishment. Tabitha was grateful for the discretion, even as she felt the weight of shame pressing down on her shoulders. Everyone in town knew about her father's debts by now, about the scandal and the foreclosure. She could feel their eyes on her whenever she walked down the street, could hear the whispers that followed in her wake. On Friday evening, Tabitha sat at the tiny desk in her room and counted her money again, trying to make the numbers add up differently. $47.30. Rent at the boarding house was $2 a week. Food would cost at least another $1. That gave her maybe 3 weeks before she was completely broke, and she still had no prospects, no plan, no idea what came next. She was staring at the coins spread across the desk when she heard shouting from downstairs. Tabitha rose and opened her door, listening to the commotion in the front hall. Mrs. Carmichael was arguing with someone, her voice sharp with anger. "I do not care what you think you are owed. You cannot just barge into my house demanding payment. The debt is legitimate, and I got the papers to prove it." The man's voice was rough and unfamiliar. Your brother borrowed money from my boss 6 months ago, and he has not paid back a cent. My brother is dead, and even if he were not, his debts are not my responsibility. Tabitha crept to the top of the stairs, peering down into the hall. Mrs. Carmichael stood facing a large man in a dusty coat, his face hard and unforgiving. Behind him were two other men, both armed and looking like the kind of trouble that usually ended in bloodshed. The law says different, lady. You inherited his property, you inherited his debts. My boss wants his money, and he is going to get it one way or another. Something cold settled in Tabitha's stomach as she watched the confrontation. If these men forced Mrs. Carmichael into bankruptcy too, then Tabitha would lose even this temporary refuge. The universe seemed determined to strip away every last shred of security she had left. She did not realize she had started down the stairs until Mrs. Carmichael looked up and saw her, her face going pale. "Miss Lansing, please go back to your room. This does not concern you." But the large man had turned to look at Tabitha too, his eyes narrowing as he took in her appearance. "Well now, who is this pretty thing?" "One of your boarders." "Leave her alone," Mrs. Carmichael said sharply. "She has nothing to do with my brother's debts." The man smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Maybe not, but I bet a girl like that could be worth something to somebody. Plenty of men out west looking for wives, willing to pay good money for a respectable woman." Horror washed over Tabitha as she understood what he was suggesting. She backed up a step, her hand gripping the banister so hard her knuckles went white. "Get out of my house," Mrs. Carmichael said, her voice shaking with fury. "Get out right now, or I will call the marshal." The man laughed. "You do that, lady, but my boss has friends in this territory and they have long memories. You think about what I said. You have until the end of the month to come up with $500, or we will be back to collect what we are owed, one way or another." He tipped his hat mockingly and left, his companions following. The door slammed behind them and Mrs. Carmichael sagged against the wall, her face buried in her hands. Tabitha hurried down the rest of the stairs and put a tentative hand on the older woman's shoulder. "Are you all right?" "No," Mrs. Carmichael whispered. "No, I am not all right. My brother was a fool and a drunk, and now his mistakes are going to cost me everything, just like your father's mistakes cost you." The bitterness in her voice was like a mirror of Tabitha's own anger, and for a moment they stood together in shared misery, two women destroyed by the carelessness of men they had loved. $500, Mrs. Carmichael said finally, lifting her head. "I do not have $500. I barely have 50. That man was from the Red Creek Mining Company, and they own half the judges in Wyoming Territory. If I do not pay, they will take the boarding house, and then I will have nothing, just like you." Tabitha's mind was racing. Maybe the marshal can help. Maybe there is something illegal about the debt, or the way they are trying to collect it. "Maybe," Mrs. Carmichael said, but she did not sound hopeful. "Or maybe we are both going to end up on the street, begging for scraps." That night, Tabitha lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering how her life had come to this. 3 weeks ago, she had been comfortable and secure, with a future that seemed bright and certain. Now she was homeless and nearly penniless, staying in a boarding house that might itself be seized by creditors, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to for help. The despair that had been hovering at the edges of her consciousness finally crashed over her in a suffocating wave. She wanted to scream, to rage against the unfairness of it all, but instead she just curled into a ball under the thin blanket and tried not to think about tomorrow. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, the first real hint of autumn in the air. Tabitha dressed in one of her simpler dresses, a gray wool that had been her everyday wear when she worked in the mercantile, and went downstairs to help Mrs. Carmichael with breakfast. The older woman looked like she had not slept either, her eyes shadowed and her movements slow and weary. They were setting out plates when the door burst open and one of the other boarders, a freight hauler named Mr. Jenkins, stumbled in looking pale and shaken. "What happened?" Mrs. Carmichael demanded. "There has been an accident on the mountain pass," Jenkins gasped. "Wagon train overturned, people hurt bad. They are bringing them into town now, looking for anyone who can help tend the injured." Tabitha did not hesitate. Her mother had taught her basic nursing skills, and there was nothing she could do about her own problems right now, but at least she could be useful to someone else. She grabbed a shawl and followed Jenkins out into the street. The town was in chaos. A wagon train had been coming down from the high country when one of the lead wagons lost a wheel on a steep section of trail. 3 wagons had overturned in the resulting collision, and a dozen people were injured, some seriously. The doctor's office was already overflowing with patients, and they were setting up a makeshift hospital in the church. Tabitha found herself assigned to help the doctor's wife, Mrs. Patterson, who was organizing supplies and directing volunteers. For the next several hours, Tabitha was too busy to think about her own troubles. She fetched water and bandages, held down screaming patients while the doctor set broken bones, cleaned wounds, and whispered soothing words to terrified children. It was late afternoon when things finally began to calm down. Most of the injured had been treated, and the seriously wounded were resting as comfortably as possible. Tabitha was washing blood off her hands in a basin outside the church when she heard someone say, "Is there a Miss Lansing here?" She turned to find a man standing a few feet away, and her breath caught in her throat. He was tall and lean, with broad shoulders and a face that looked like it had been carved from sun-weathered stone. His hair was dark brown and too long, curling over his collar, and his eyes were the color of a Wyoming sky just before a storm. He wore dusty trail clothes and a gun belt slung low on his hips, and there was something about the way he carried himself that spoke of confidence and competence in equal measure. "I am Tabitha Lansing," she said, drying her hands on her already stained apron. "Lucas Zimmerman," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I was told you might be able to help me. My sister was on that wagon train. She is hurt, and the doc says she needs someone to sit with her tonight, keep an eye on her in case the concussion gets worse. Mrs. Patterson said you were good with the patients, gentle-like." Tabitha glanced back at the church where she could see several forms lying on makeshift beds. "Of course, I can help. Which one is your sister? This way," Lucas said, leading her back inside. His sister was a girl of about 16, with the same dark hair and strong features as her brother. She lay on a pallet near the back of the church, her face pale and a bandage wrapped around her head. Her eyes were closed, but they fluttered open as Lucas knelt beside her. "Sarah, I found someone to stay with you tonight," he said, his voice gentler than Tabitha would have expected from a man who looked so hard and rough. "I told you I am fine," Sarah mumbled, her words slightly slurred. "You do not need to fuss. Doc says otherwise, and I am not about to lose you because you are too stubborn to admit you need help." He looked up at Tabitha. "She is all the family I got. I would be mighty grateful if you could watch over her." There was something in his eyes when he said it, a vulnerability that seemed at odds with his tough exterior, and Tabitha found herself nodding before she had really thought about it. "I will take good care of her," she promised. Lucas smiled, and the expression transformed his face completely, warming those storm-colored eyes and making him look younger, almost boyish. "Thank you, Miss Lansing. I appreciate it more than I can say." He left to tend to his horses, and Tabitha settled in beside Sarah with a damp cloth and a bowl of water. The night ahead would be long, but at least it gave her something to do, some way to be useful. She dabbed at Sarah's forehead, cooling the fever that was starting to build, and tried not to think about what would happen when morning came, and she had to face her own uncertain future again. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness throughout the night, sometimes lucid, and sometimes rambling about places and people Tabitha did not know. Tabitha stayed beside her, monitoring her breathing and her pulse, making sure she did not slip into a deeper unconsciousness that might mean real danger. Around midnight, Lucas returned with coffee and sandwiches from the hotel, settling on the floor on the other side of his sister. "How is she?" he asked quietly, so as not to disturb the other patients sleeping nearby. "Holding steady," Tabitha reported. "The fever is not too high and she has been waking regularly. I think the doctor is right that she will recover, but it will take time." Lucas nodded, relief evident on his face. "Sarah is tougher than she looks, had to be growing up the way we did." Tabitha found herself curious despite her exhaustion. "Where are you from, Mr. Zimmerman?" "Lucas," he corrected. "And we are from all over, I guess. Our folks had a small ranch down in Colorado, but they died when Sarah was just a baby. I have been raising her ever since, moving around wherever I could find work. Cowboying mostly, sometimes breaking horses, sometimes guiding for hunting parties. We were heading up to Montana, heard there might be good land available for homesteading." "That is a long way to travel," Tabitha said. "It is, but we are used to it, been on the move most of our lives." He studied her for a moment, his gaze assessing but not unkind. "What about you, Miss Lansing?" "I heard some talk in town about troubles at the Mercantile." Tabitha stiffened, her defenses rising automatically. "I would rather not discuss it if you do not mind." "Fair enough," Lucas said easily. "We have all got things we would rather not talk about. I just wanted you to know that I understand what it is like to lose everything. Sarah and we have started over more times than I can count. It never gets easier, but it does get possible, if that makes sense." Despite herself, Tabitha felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. There was no judgment in Lucas's voice, no pity, just a simple statement of shared experience. It was oddly comforting. "How old were you when your parents died?" she asked. 14. Sarah was not even 2 years old yet. I did not have any idea how to take care of a baby, but I figured it out. "Had to." He smiled slightly, looking down at his sleeping sister. "She turned out all right despite my fumbling." "You must love her very much," Tabitha said softly. "She is all I got," Lucas said simply. "And I am all she has. We take care of each other." They sat in silence for a while, drinking the coffee that had long since gone lukewarm. Tabitha found herself studying Lucas's face in the dim lamplight, noticing the small scar above his right eyebrow, the way his jaw was perpetually shadowed with stubble, the calluses on his hands that spoke of years of hard work. He was not handsome in the conventional sense, but there was something compelling about him, something solid and real that made her feel safer than she had felt in weeks. "Can I ask you something?" Lucas said suddenly. "I suppose. That man at the boarding house yesterday, the one making threats. Was that about your father's debts?" Tabitha felt her face flame with embarrassment. "You heard about that, small town. Word travels." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Those men work for some bad people, Miss Lansing, the kind who do not stop at legal threats. If they think they can make money off you or Mrs. Carmichael, they will try, and they will not be gentle about it." "I do not have any money," Tabitha said bitterly. "They cannot get blood from a stone." "They do not need your money, they need you." Lucas's voice was grim. "There are men out west who will pay good money for a wife. No questions asked. Women are scarce in the mining camps and the logging towns, and some of those men are not too particular about whether the woman is willing or not. I have seen it happen before, seen women disappear into situations they could not get out of. Horror crawled up Tabitha's spine. Surely the law would not allow such a thing. The law is not always on the side of people like us, Lucas said bluntly. Rich men buy judges and sheriffs, and then they do whatever they want. If those men from the Red Creek Mining Company decide you are worth more as merchandise than as a free woman, they will make it happen, and there will not be much anyone can do to stop them. Tabitha wanted to argue, to insist that such things could not happen in a civilized territory, but she had already learned how quickly civilization could crumble when money was involved. Her father's creditors had stripped her of everything she owned without a second thought, following the letter of the law even as they destroyed her life. Why would other predators be any different? What am I supposed to do? She whispered. Lucas was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. Sarah and I are leaving for Montana as soon as she is well enough to travel. It is going to be a hard journey and we could use the help. If you wanted to come with us, you would be welcome. We do not have much to offer, but it would get you away from Fort Bridger and those men who are looking to profit off your troubles. Tabitha stared at him, too shocked to respond immediately. Go to Montana with two people she barely knew. Leave behind everything familiar, even if that everything had already been taken from her. It was insane, reckless, dangerous. It was also the only option she had. I do not understand, she said slowly. Why would you help me? You do not even know me. I know you have been sitting here all night taking care of my sister without complaint, even though you have got your own troubles weighing on you. I know you jumped in to help when those folks were hurt, not asking for anything in return. That tells me you are decent people, and decent people are worth helping. He met her gaze steadily. Besides, like I said, Sarah and I could use the help. She is going to need nursing for a while, and I cannot tend to her and manage the wagon and the horses all at the same time. You would be earning your way, not asking for charity. It was carefully phrased to preserve her pride, and Tabitha appreciated that more than she could say. But still, the idea of traveling hundreds of miles with a strange man, even one who seemed kind, was terrifying. I will need to think about it, she said finally. Of course, Lucas said, but do not think too long. We will be leaving within the week as soon as Sarah can handle the journey. If you are not with us, you will still be here when those men come back, and I do not think that will end well for you. He was right, and they both knew it. Tabitha looked down at Sarah, who was sleeping more peacefully now, her breathing steady and deep. This girl, this stranger, might be her only lifeline to safety, to a future that did not involve being sold off like cattle to the highest bidder. I will give you my answer by tomorrow evening, Tabitha said. Lucas nodded and stood, stretching his tall frame. That is fair. I will check back in the morning. Thank you again for watching over her. After he left, Tabitha sat alone in the quiet church, listening to the soft sounds of sleeping injured and trying to imagine a future in Montana. She did not know anything about homesteading or frontier life. She had spent her whole life in a comfortable town, working in a store, dealing with ledgers and customers and inventory. What could she possibly contribute to a rough journey north into unknown territory? But then she thought about the alternative, staying in Fort Bridger with no money, no prospects, and men who saw her as a commodity to be exploited. She thought about the shame and the whispers, about slowly starving or being forced into some desperate bargain that would strip away what little dignity she had left. At least Montana offered possibility. At least it offered escape. By the time dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Tabitha had made her decision. It was reckless and terrifying and probably foolish, but it was a choice, her choice, and that mattered more than safety or certainty. When Lucas returned in the morning with more coffee and fresh bread, she told him she would go. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah's condition improved steadily, her fever breaking and her eyes clearing as the danger of serious concussion passed. She was a sweet girl, quick to smile despite her injuries, and she seemed genuinely pleased when Lucas told her that Tabitha would be traveling with them. "It will be nice to have another woman around," Sarah said, squeezing Tabitha's hand. "Lucas tries his best, but sometimes a girl needs female company, you know." Tabitha found herself warming to the younger woman immediately. Sarah reminded her a bit of herself at that age, before the weight of responsibility and loss had settled onto her shoulders. There was an optimism in Sarah, a belief that good things were still possible, and Tabitha envied it even as she hoped some of it might rub off on her. Lucas spent those days making arrangements for the journey, buying supplies with money he seemed to have saved carefully, checking the wagon and the horses to make sure everything was sound for the long trip ahead. He consulted with Tabitha about what she would need, treating her like a partner rather than a burden, and she appreciated his matter-of-fact approach. On the second day, Tabitha went back to the boarding house to collect her trunk and found Mrs. Carmichael in tears. The men from the Red Creek Mining Company had returned, more threatening than before, and the marshal had been unable or unwilling to do anything about it. "They gave me 2 more weeks," Mrs. Carmichael sobbed. 2 weeks to come up with $500, or they are taking the house and everything in it. They also asked about you, wanted to know if you were still here. I told them you had left town already, but I do not think they believed me." Cold fear washed through Tabitha. "I am leaving tomorrow," she said. "I found a way out of Fort Bridger." "How?" Mrs. Carmichael looked up, hope and desperation warring in her eyes. Tabitha explained about Lucas and Sarah, about the offer to travel north with them. The older woman listened and then slowly nodded. "It is probably the smartest thing you could do," she said. "Those men, they are dangerous. I have heard stories about what happens to women who get tangled up with the Red Creek Company. You are better off anywhere else." "What will you do?" Tabitha asked. "I do not know. Sell what I can, maybe. Try to raise at least part of what they claim I owe and hope they will take it as settlement." Mrs. Carmichael wiped her eyes. "Do not worry about me, dear. You have your own future to think about." They hugged goodbye, and Tabitha left the boarding house for the last time, her trunk carried by one of Lucas's friends. She did not look back. Looking back only made the leaving hurt more, and she needed to be strong now, needed to focus on survival rather than sentiment. That evening, she joined Lucas and Sarah at their campsite just outside of town. They had decided to leave at first light, before most of Fort Bridger was awake, avoiding any awkward questions or potential interference from the men who might still be looking for Tabitha. The 3 of them sat around a small fire, eating beans and bacon that Lucas cooked in a battered skillet. It was simple food, nothing like the elaborate meals Tabitha had enjoyed back when her father was alive, and she thought she was wealthy, but it tasted better than anything she had eaten in weeks. Maybe it was the fresh air, or maybe it was just the relief of knowing she was doing something, taking control of her life instead of letting circumstances crush her. "So, Montana," Sarah said, poking at the fire with a stick. "What do you think it will be like?" "Cold," Lucas said dryly. "Especially come winter. We need to get settled fast, find a piece of land and start building before the first snow." "Do you know how to build a house?" Tabitha asked. "I have done it before. It is not pretty work, but it is doable. We will need to get a cabin up, dig a well, maybe put in a root cellar for storing food through the winter." He looked at Tabitha. "I know it is not going to be easy. Life on a homestead never is. but it will be ours, free and clear, and nobody can take it away from us as long as we work the land and follow the requirements." The way he said ours made something flutter in Tabitha's chest, a strange combination of fear and anticipation. She barely knew this man, but already she was tying her future to his, trusting him with her safety and her survival. It was insane, but it was also exhilarating in a way she had never experienced before. "I will work hard," she promised. "I am not afraid of labor. I just do not know much about frontier life." "You will learn," Sarah said confidently. "We all will. That is what adventures are for, right? Learning new things." Tabitha smiled despite her nerves. "I suppose that is one way to look at it." They talked late into the night, and Tabitha found herself relaxing in a way she had not managed since her father died. Lucas had a dry sense of humor that occasionally broke through his serious exterior, and Sarah was full of enthusiasm and questions about everything. They felt like good people, the kind who would keep their promises and stand by their word. When they finally bedded down for the night, Tabitha lying in the wagon while Lucas and Sarah slept under it in their bedrolls, she stared up at the canvas cover and wondered what the hell she was doing. Tomorrow she would leave Fort Bridger forever, heading into an unknown future with virtual strangers. Everything sensible in her screamed that this was a mistake, that she should stay and try to work things out somehow. But then she thought about those men from the Red Creek Mining Company, about the way they had looked at her like she was livestock to be sold, and she knew she was making the right choice. Whatever happened in Montana, it had to be better than that. Dawn came too quickly, the sky still gray and uncertain as they hitched the horses to the wagon and made final preparations. Lucas checked every harness and strap twice, making sure nothing would fail on the trail, while Sarah organized their supplies and Tabitha secured her trunk in the wagon bed. They were just about to climb up onto the wagon seat when a voice called out from behind them. "Leaving so soon, Miss Lansing?" Tabitha spun around, her heart sinking as she recognized the large man from the boarding house, the one who worked for the Red Creek Mining Company. He was standing about 20 feet away, his two companions flanking him, all three of them looking smug and dangerous. "I do not have anything to say to you," Tabitha said, proud that her voice did not shake. "That is too bad because I got plenty to say to you." The man walked closer, ignoring Lucas, who had moved to stand protectively between him and the wagon. "See, I did some asking around, found out that your daddy owed money to my boss too. Not much, but enough that it gives us a legal claim on anything he left behind, including you." "That is not how the law works," Tabitha said. "It is when my boss says it is. Now you are going to come with us nice and quiet-like, and we will forget about the money your daddy owed. Or we can do this the hard way, and your friends here might get hurt in the process." Lucas's hand moved toward his gun, and Tabitha's breath caught in her throat. Violence was the last thing she wanted, but she could see the cold determination in the stranger's eyes, could tell he was not going to back down. "The lady is traveling with me," Lucas said, his voice flat and hard. "She does not owe you anything, and she is not going anywhere with you." "You really want to die for some woman you just met?" the man asked, almost conversationally. "If it comes to that," Lucas said, "but I am betting it does not. I am betting you and your friends are the kind who only fight when the odds are in your favor, and right now, they are not." The man laughed. 3 against 1 does not sound like good odds for you, friend." 3 against 2, Sarah said, and Tabitha saw with horror that the girl had pulled a rifle from the wagon and was aiming it steadily at the strangers. "And I am a real good shot, even with a concussion." 3 against 3, came another voice, and Marshal Davies stepped out from behind a nearby building, his own gun drawn. "And I represent the actual law around here, not whatever bastardized version your boss likes to use. Miss Lansing is free to leave town with whoever she chooses, and if you try to stop her, I will arrest you for kidnapping and assault." The tension stretched out for what felt like an eternity, the six of them frozen in a tableau of potential violence. Then the large man spat on the ground and holstered his gun. "This is not over," he said. "My boss has a long reach and he does not forget debts." "Neither do I," Lucas said softly. "And if I ever see you near Miss Lansing again, I will remember this conversation real clear." The strangers retreated and Tabitha sagged against the wagon, her legs suddenly weak. Lucas caught her elbow, steadying her, and the warmth of his hand seemed to seep through the layers of fabric and into her bones. "Thank you," she whispered to the marshal. "Just doing my job, Miss Lansing," Davy said, tipping his hat. "But you folks should get moving. Those men might come back with reinforcements and I cannot be everywhere at once." They did not need any more encouragement. Lucas helped Tabitha up onto the wagon seat, then climbed up beside her with Sarah settling in the back. With a flick of the reins, they started moving, rolling out of Fort Bridger as the sun finally broke over the horizon, painting everything in shades of gold. Tabitha looked back once, watching the town grow smaller and smaller behind them. Everything she had known was back there, every memory and familiar landmark, but she did not feel sad. She felt free. The first week on the trail was an education in discomfort and endurance. Tabitha had never spent so much time outdoors, never slept on the ground or cooked over an open fire or gone days without a proper bath. Her hands blistered from helping with the camp chores. Her muscles ached from the constant jolting of the wagon, and she discovered that the romantic notion of frontier travel had very little to do with the dusty, exhausting reality. But she also discovered that she was stronger than she had thought. She learned to build a fire that did not smoke, to make biscuits in a Dutch oven, to recognize the signs of good water and bad. Lucas was a patient teacher, showing her what she needed to know without making her feel stupid for not knowing it already. Sarah helped too, sharing the tricks she had learned over years of traveling with her brother. They fell into a rhythm quickly. Up at dawn, break camp, travel until midday, rest the horses, travel until dusk, make camp again. It was monotonous in some ways, but Tabitha found herself appreciating the simplicity of it. There was no time to worry about the future when she was focused on the present, on putting one foot in front of the other and surviving each day as it came. Lucas was different on the trail than he had been in town, more relaxed, more open. He talked about his plans for the homestead, about the kind of life he wanted to build for Sarah. He spoke about his parents sometimes, his voice going soft with memory, and Tabitha found herself sharing stories about her own mother, about the woman who had taught her to sew and read and believe in herself. She did not talk about her father much. The wound was still too raw, the betrayal too fresh. Lucas seemed to understand without needing explanations, and she was grateful for his discretion. Sarah was a bright spot in every day, always finding something to laugh about even when the trail was hard and the weather uncooperative. She told elaborate stories about the life she imagined having in Montana, complete with a garden and chickens, and maybe a cow if they could afford one. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Tabitha often found herself smiling at the girl's boundless optimism. They crossed into Montana territory on the 10th day, and Tabitha felt something shift inside her, some recognition that she was entering a new phase of her life. The landscape here was different from Wyoming, more wild and untamed, with forests that seemed to stretch forever and mountains that scraped the sky. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, and she understood why Lucas had chosen this place to start over. They stopped in a small settlement called Willow Creek to resupply and ask about available homestead land. The land office agent was a grizzled old man named Patterson, who spread maps across his desk and pointed out several parcels that met the requirements for claiming. "This one here is good land," Patterson said, tapping a spot on the map. "Water access from the creek, some flat ground for planting, timber for building. It is remote, though. Nearest neighbors are about 5 miles out, and the town is a good half-day ride." "That suits us fine," Lucas said. "We are not looking for crowds." They filed the claim that afternoon, and Tabitha signed the papers as part of Lucas's household, listed as a companion to his sister. It was not entirely accurate, but it kept things simple and avoided uncomfortable questions. The important thing was that they now had legal rights to 160 acres of Montana wilderness, and all they had to do was build a dwelling, cultivate some of the land, and live there for 5 years to prove up the claim and own it outright. 5 years, Sarah said as they left the land office. "That seems like forever." "It will go faster than you think," Lucas told her. "Especially once we get busy building and planting. Time flies when you are working hard." They reached their new land 2 days later, arriving in the late afternoon when the sun was slanting through the trees and everything was bathed in golden light. Lucas had chosen well. The creek ran clear and cold along one edge of the property, providing fresh water year-round. There was a natural clearing that would be perfect for the cabin and a garden, and beyond that, timber stretched up the mountainside, ready to be harvested for building. Tabitha climbed down from the wagon and stood in the middle of the clearing, turning slowly to take it all in. It was wild and untamed and completely unlike anywhere she had ever lived. It was also hers, in a way that nothing had ever been hers before. Not inherited, not borrowed, not built on credit and lies. This land belonged to them, to the 3 of them together, and whatever they made of it would be their own creation. "What do you think?" Lucas asked, coming to stand beside her. "I think it is perfect," Tabitha said honestly. "I think we can build something real here." He smiled, that rare, warm expression that transformed his whole face. "I think so too." They pitched a tent that night, a temporary shelter while they planned and prepared for the real work of building a cabin. Lucas walked the property with Tabitha, pointing out where things should go and explaining his vision for the homestead. He talked about crop rotation and animal husbandry, about selling timber to the mining operations farther north, about gradually building something sustainable and profitable. Tabitha listened and asked questions, her mind already working on the practical details. She might not know much about farming, but she understood business, understood inventory and planning and making resources stretch. She could contribute here, could be a real partner in this venture rather than just dead weight. As the days turned into weeks, the 3 of them threw themselves into the work of homesteading. Lucas felled trees and stripped logs, building the frame of a cabin with practiced efficiency. Tabitha and Sarah helped where they could, hauling stones for the foundation, splitting shingles for the roof, chinking the gaps between logs with a mixture of mud and grass. It was back-breaking work, harder than anything Tabitha had ever done, but she found a strange satisfaction in it. Every log raised, every wall completed, was tangible proof of their progress, their determination to make a life here. Her hands grew calloused, and her muscles grew strong, and she discovered that physical exhaustion at the end of the day was almost pleasant, a clean tiredness that had nothing to do with emotional turmoil or social anxiety. The cabin began to take shape, one room for now with plans to add more later. Lucas built a stone fireplace that would provide heat through the winter, and Tabitha carefully measured out space for a kitchen area, sleeping quarters, and a small sitting room. Sarah was in charge of the garden, clearing a plot near the cabin and planning what they would plant in the spring. As they worked, Tabitha found herself noticing things about Lucas that she had not paid attention to before. The way his muscles flexed when he swung an axe, the concentration on his face when he was fitting logs together, the gentleness in his hands when he helped her navigate a difficult task. He was always respectful, always careful not to stand too close or touch her unnecessarily, but there were moments when their eyes met and something passed between them, some acknowledgement of a connection that was growing deeper than simple friendship. Tabitha told herself it was just gratitude, just the natural result of working closely with someone who had saved her from a desperate situation. But in the quiet moments before sleep, when she lay in her bedroll and listened to the night sounds of the forest, she admitted to herself that it was more than that. She was attracted to Lucas, drawn to his strength and his integrity, and the way he made her feel safe without making her feel weak. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, this realization that she was developing feelings for a man she had known only a few weeks. Tabitha had been courted before, back in Fort Bridger when she was the merchant's daughter, and eligible suitors saw her as a good match. But those interactions had been formal and calculated, nothing like the easy companionship she shared with Lucas. She did not know if he felt the same way. He was always kind to her, always thoughtful, but he treated her the same way he treated Sarah, with a protective concern that might be brotherly rather than romantic. Tabitha did not want to misread the situation, did not want to make things awkward when they were dependent on each other for survival. So she kept her feelings to herself and focused on the work, on building this new life one day at a time. The cabin was nearly finished when the first snow fell in late October. It was early for snow even in Montana, and Lucas looked worried as he watched the flakes drift down from a gray sky. "We need to finish the roof and get the door hung," he said. "If winter sets in hard before we are sealed up, we will be in trouble." They worked frantically over the next 3 days, racing against the weather. Lucas finished the roof while Tabitha and Sarah packed mud and grass into every crack they could find, trying to make the cabin as weatherproof as possible. On the 3rd day, Lucas hung the door, a heavy thing made from split logs bound with iron straps they had purchased in Willow Creek. That night, they moved into the cabin for the first time. It was rough and unfinished, with a dirt floor and no furniture except the crates they had been using for storage, but it was theirs. Tabitha stood in the center of the single room, looking around at the walls they had built together, and felt a swell of pride and accomplishment unlike anything she had ever experienced. "We did it," Sarah said, her voice awed. "We actually built a house." "We did," Lucas agreed, grinning at his sister. "And just in time, too. That snow is not going to let up any time soon." He was right. The snow fell steadily for the next 2 days, blanketing everything in white and trapping them inside the cabin. But they were warm and dry, the fireplace throwing heat into the small space, and they had enough supplies to last through any storm. Tabitha found the enforced intimacy of those snow-bound days both challenging and oddly pleasant. The 3 of them played cards, told stories, and worked on small projects to improve the cabin. Lucas carved wooden pegs to serve as hooks for hanging things. Sarah mended clothes and blankets, and Tabitha organized their supplies and took inventory of what they would need to purchase when the weather cleared. On the 3rd night, when Sarah had fallen asleep in her corner of the cabin, Lucas and Tabitha sat by the fire, speaking in low voices so as not to wake her. "Thank you for everything you have done," Lucas said quietly. "I know this is not the life you imagined for yourself." "I did not imagine any life for myself," Tabitha admitted. After my father died, I could not see past the next day. You gave me a reason to keep going, a purpose. I should be thanking you." "We helped each other," Lucas said. "That is what people do when they care about each other." The way he said "care about each other" made Tabitha's heart skip a beat. She looked at him, trying to read his expression in the flickering firelight, but his face was shadowed and difficult to decipher. "Lucas, I need to ask you something," she said, gathering her courage. "Anything." "Why did you really ask me to come with you? You said it was to help with Sarah, but she is fine now. You could have left me behind in Fort Bridger and managed just fine on your own." Lucas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but steady. "I asked you to come because I thought you deserved a chance, a fresh start. But that is not the whole truth." He turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw vulnerability and longing and hope. "The truth is, I was drawn to you from the moment I saw you. You were helping those injured people, covered in blood and exhausted, and you were still so determined to do good, to be useful. I saw strength in you, real strength, and I wanted to know you better. Wanted to see what might be possible between us, given time and opportunity." Tabitha's breath caught in her throat. "Are you saying what I think you are saying?" "I am saying that I have feelings for you, Tabitha. Deep feelings that go way beyond gratitude or friendship. I am saying that every day we have spent together has only made those feelings stronger." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "But I also know we have not known each other long, and I do not want to pressure you into anything. If all you feel for me is friendship, I can accept that. I just needed you to know that I see you as more than a companion or a helper. I see you as a woman I could love if you will let me." Tabitha felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were good tears, happy tears. "I have feelings for you too," she whispered. "I have been trying not to admit it to myself because it seemed too fast, too impossible. But the truth is, I think I started falling for you the night you trusted me to care for Sarah. You looked at me like I mattered, like I was important, and I had not felt that way in so long." Lucas smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. "You matter," he said firmly. "You are important. To me, to Sarah, to this place we are building together. I cannot imagine doing this without you now." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture so sweet and old-fashioned that it made Tabitha's heart ache with tenderness. She leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and Lucas met her halfway. Their lips touched, tentative at first and then with growing confidence, and Tabitha felt like something inside her that had been frozen for months was finally beginning to thaw. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard and smiling like fools. "We should probably take this slow," Lucas said, though he did not let go of her hand. "Probably," Tabitha agreed. "But I do not want to be cautious anymore. I have spent too long being careful, following rules, doing what was expected. I want to follow my heart for once, even if it is terrifying." "Is your heart telling you anything in particular right now?" Lucas asked, his eyes dancing with amusement and affection. "It is telling me that I love you," Tabitha said, the words coming out in a rush. "I know it is too soon and too fast, but I cannot deny it anymore. I love you, Lucas Zimmerman." "I love you too, Tabitha Lansing," Lucas said. And then he was kissing her again, deeper this time, with a passion that made the cold cabin feel like the warmest place on earth. They stayed up talking long after the fire had burned down to embers, making plans and sharing dreams. Lucas wanted to marry her, he said, wanted to make this partnership official and permanent. Tabitha felt a flutter of anxiety at the idea of marriage after swearing she would never depend on a man again, but this was different. Lucas was not asking her to give up her independence or her identity. He was asking her to be his equal partner in building a life together. "Yes," she said. Yes, I will marry you." Lucas whooped with joy, waking Sarah, who sat up groggily and looked at them in confusion. "What is happening?" "Tabitha and I are getting married," Lucas announced, grinning like a boy who had just received the best Christmas present ever. Sarah's face lit up. "Really? That is wonderful." She scrambled out of her blankets and hugged them both. "I knew you two liked each other. I have been waiting for you to figure it out." They all laughed, and for the first time since her father died, Tabitha felt genuinely happy. Not just content or hopeful, but truly, deeply happy. She had found a place where she belonged, people who loved her, and a future that was bright with possibility. The snow melted after a few days, and as soon as the trails were passable, Lucas rode into Willow Creek to speak with the circuit preacher. Tabitha spent the time making preparations for the wedding, such as they were. She had no fancy dress, no flowers, no elaborate decorations. What she had was a clean wool dress that Sarah helped her alter to fit better, a bouquet of dried herbs tied with ribbon, and a cabin that they scrubbed until it gleamed. The preacher arrived on a cold November morning, riding up to the cabin on a sturdy mule. He was an elderly man named Reverend Thompson, with a white beard and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. "I understand we have a wedding to perform," he said, dismounting with a grunt. "Yes, sir," Lucas said, shaking the preacher's hand. "Thank you for coming all this way." "It is my calling," Reverend Thompson said simply, "and I am always happy to see two people committing their lives to each other in holy matrimony." The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. They stood in front of the fireplace, with Sarah serving as witness, and spoke the traditional vows that bound them together as husband and wife. When Reverend Thompson pronounced them married, Lucas kissed Tabitha with such tenderness that she felt tears slip down her cheeks. "You are my family now," Lucas whispered against her lips. "You and Sarah. We are going to make a good life here, I promise you that." "We already have," Tabitha said, smiling through her tears. The preacher stayed for a meal, and they shared what food they had in celebration. It was not a fancy wedding breakfast by any measure, just beans and bacon and biscuits, but it tasted like the finest feast to Tabitha. She was married. She had a husband who loved her, a sister in Sarah, and a home that they had built with their own hands. It was more than she had dared to hope for just 2 months ago. After the preacher left, the three of them stood outside the cabin, looking out over their land. The afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds, casting long shadows across the clearing, and Tabitha could see the potential here, could imagine the garden in spring, the fields of wheat, maybe a barn and some livestock. "What are you thinking about?" Lucas asked, wrapping his arm around her waist. "The future," Tabitha said. "All the things we are going to do here." "Like what?" "Like planting an orchard and building a bigger house and maybe raising children." She looked up at him, suddenly shy. "Would you want children?" Lucas's face softened. "I would love children, as many as you want to give me." Sarah made a face. "I am not ready to be an aunt yet. Can we wait at least a little while before you start making babies?" They all laughed, and Lucas ruffled his sister's hair. "You will be an aunt when you are an aunt, Squirt. We do not get to control the timing on these things." As it turned out, the timing was sooner than any of them expected. By January, Tabitha suspected she was pregnant, and by February she was certain. The morning sickness was unmistakable, as was the tender fullness in her breasts, and the exhaustion that seemed to hit her at odd moments throughout the day. When she told Lucas, his reaction was everything she had hoped for. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy, and then set her down gently as if suddenly remembering that she was fragile. "Are you happy?" Tabitha asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Lucas said, cupping her face in his hands. We are going to have a baby. Our baby. How could I be anything but thrilled? Sarah was excited too, already planning how she would help with the new baby and what they should name it. The three of them spent the long winter evenings discussing possibilities, from traditional family names to more unusual choices inspired by the Montana landscape. The winter was hard, with bitter cold and deep snow that sometimes kept them trapped in the cabin for days at a time. But they were warm and well supplied, and Lucas had built the cabin sturdy enough to withstand the worst storms. Tabitha spent the time sewing baby clothes and blankets, preparing for the arrival of their first child. Her hands, which had once been soft from a life of comfort, were now work-hardened and capable, and she took pride in every tiny garment she created. Lucas used the winter to plan for spring, sketching out where they would plant crops and how they would expand the cabin. He talked about building a proper bedroom for him and Tabitha, giving them some privacy now that they were married, and maybe adding a loft where Sarah could have her own space. "We will need more room once the baby comes," he said, studying his rough drawings by firelight. "Maybe a nursery too, if we can manage it." "One thing at a time," Tabitha said practically, though she loved his enthusiasm and his determination to provide well for their growing family. Spring came slowly, the snow melting in reluctant patches and the creek swelling with runoff. As soon as the ground was soft enough to work, Lucas began plowing a field for planting. Tabitha helped when she could, though her growing belly made some tasks more difficult. Sarah took over much of the heavy work, proving herself to be stronger and more capable than her slight frame suggested. They planted wheat and corn, potatoes and beans, laying the foundation for a harvest that would sustain them through the next winter. Tabitha started her herb garden near the cabin, planting medicinal plants along with culinary ones, remembering her mother's teachings about which herbs were useful for what ailments. As summer approached and Tabitha's pregnancy advanced, she found herself thinking often about her mother and father. Her mother would have loved to be a grandmother, would have been here helping prepare for the baby and offering advice. Her father, despite his flaws and his mistakes, would have been proud to see her thriving in this new life. The anger she had felt toward her father had faded over the months, replaced by a more complicated understanding. He had been human, fallible, capable of poor judgment and reckless choices. But he had also loved her in his way and wanted good things for her. He had just been too weak to achieve them honestly. Tabitha had learned from his mistakes. She and Lucas lived within their means, never borrowing what they could not repay, never pretending to be something they were not. It was a simpler life, a harder life, but it was honest and real, and that mattered more than any amount of false prosperity. The baby came in late July, arriving on a sweltering afternoon when the heat seemed to press down from a cloudless sky. Tabitha labored for nearly 12 hours, with Sarah acting as midwife under Lucas's anxious supervision. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced, wave after wave of it that made her scream and curse and swear she would never do this again. But then the baby was born, a healthy boy with dark hair and lungs that worked perfectly, announcing his arrival with indignant wails. Lucas cut the cord with shaking hands and then placed the baby on Tabitha's chest, tears streaming down his weathered face. "He is perfect," Lucas whispered. "You did so good, Tabitha. He is absolutely perfect." Tabitha cradled her son, exhausted and overwhelmed and more in love than she had known was possible. This tiny person with his scrunched-up face and waving fists was hers. Hers and Lucas's, a living symbol of everything they had built together. They named him Marcus, after Tabitha's father, with Lucas's surname. Marcus Zimmerman. The baby who represented hope and new beginnings, a future untainted by the mistakes of the past. Sarah was a devoted aunt, constantly wanting to hold Marcus and help with his care. She sang to him and rocked him and changed his diapers without complaint. And Tabitha was grateful for the help during those first exhausting weeks when she was still recovering from childbirth and learning how to be a mother. Lucas was a natural father, gentle and patient with his son. He would hold Marcus for hours, just staring at him in wonder, and Tabitha would watch them together and feel her heart expand with love. This was her family, these people who had started as strangers and become the most important part of her world. The harvest that fall was good, better than they had dared to hope for their first season. They had enough wheat and corn to see them through the winter with plenty to spare, and Lucas was able to sell some of the surplus in Willow Creek for cash. With the money, he bought supplies for expanding the cabin, determined to finish the bedroom and the loft before the snow came. They worked together through the autumn, racing against the changing weather. Tabitha worked alongside Lucas and Sarah when she could, with Marcus strapped to her back in a sling Sarah had sewn. The baby seemed content with the arrangement, sleeping peacefully while his mother helped build the additions to their home. By November, the cabin had grown substantially. There was now a proper bedroom for Lucas and Tabitha, with a real bed that Lucas had built from timber he had felled and milled himself. Sarah had her loft, reached by a ladder, and there was a separate space designated as a nursery for Marcus. They had even added a small covered porch, giving them somewhere to sit on pleasant evenings and watch the sun set over the mountains. The second winter was easier than the first, now that they knew what to expect and had prepared accordingly. They had more food stored, more firewood stacked, more knowledge about how to survive the brutal Montana cold. Marcus thrived despite the harsh conditions, growing bigger and stronger every day, his dark eyes alert and curious about the world around him. On Christmas Eve, the three adults sat around the fireplace while Marcus slept in his cradle, and Tabitha felt a profound sense of peace. 2 years ago, she had been living a lie, comfortable but fundamentally insecure. 1 year ago, she had lost everything and thought her life was over. Now she had more than she had ever imagined possible. A husband who loved her, a healthy son, a sister in Sarah, and a home that was truly theirs. "What are you thinking about?" Lucas asked, taking her hand. "How far we have come," Tabitha said. "How much has changed in such a short time." "Do you ever regret it? Leaving Fort Bridger, choosing this life?" "Never," Tabitha said firmly. "Everything I lost back there, it was not really mine. This, though, this is real. This is earned. I would not trade it for anything." Lucas kissed her, sweet and lingering, and Sarah made an exaggerated gagging sound from her corner. "You two are disgustingly romantic," she complained, but she was smiling. "Get used to it," Lucas said, grinning at his sister. "We are going to be disgustingly romantic for the rest of our lives." The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and growth. They expanded the farm gradually, adding more fields and eventually purchasing some livestock, chickens for eggs, a milk cow, a few pigs. Lucas built a barn to house them, working through the summer while Tabitha tended the garden and cared for Marcus. When Marcus was 2, Tabitha became pregnant again. This time she was less nervous, more confident in her body's ability to bring a child into the world. The second baby arrived in early spring, a daughter they named Emma. She had Tabitha's lighter hair and Lucas's storm-colored eyes, and she completed their family in a way that felt both perfect and inevitable. Sarah, who was now 20 years old, had attracted the attention of a young man from Willow Creek, a carpenter named James who was helping to build the new church. Lucas was predictably protective, interrogating the poor man thoroughly before allowing him to court his sister. But it was clear that James was sincere, and Sarah was smitten. They married the following summer, and James moved into the homestead, building a small house for himself and Sarah on the far side of the property. It was still close enough for them all to help each other, but far enough to give the young couple privacy. James proved to be a valuable addition to their small community, his carpentry skills helping them build and repair faster than Lucas could have managed alone. By the time Marcus was 5 and Emma was 3, the homestead looked nothing like the raw wilderness they had claimed 6 years earlier. There were multiple buildings now. The expanded cabin that served as the main house, Sarah and James's cottage, a large barn, a chicken coop, a smokehouse, and a root cellar. The fields stretched across acres of cultivated land, and they had added apple trees that were just beginning to produce fruit. Tabitha looked around sometimes and marveled at what they had created. This thriving farm, this close-knit family, this life of purpose and meaning. None of it would have been possible if she had not lost everything first, if Lucas had not offered her a chance to start over, if she had not been brave enough to take it. One evening in late summer, after the children were asleep and Sarah and James had gone to their own home, Tabitha and Lucas sat on the porch they had built so many years ago. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and everything was peaceful and perfect. "You remember what you said to me that first night in Fort Bridger?" Tabitha asked, leaning against Lucas's shoulder. "I said a lot of things that night," Lucas replied, wrapping his arm around her. "You said that you and Sarah had started over more times than you could count, that it never got easier but it did get possible." Tabitha smiled at the memory. "You were right. But what you did not tell me is that starting over can lead to something better than what you had before. That losing everything can be the beginning of finding what actually matters." "You found everything with me," Lucas said softly, echoing the words he had spoken years ago when he first invited her to join them. "Just like I found everything with you. We found it together," Tabitha corrected. "That is what makes it real." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear overhead, scattered across the darkening sky like diamonds. Marcus called out in his sleep, and Tabitha started to rise, but Lucas gently pulled her back. "I will check on him," he said, kissing her forehead. "You rest." Tabitha watched him go inside, this man who had saved her and loved her and built a life with her. She thought about the girl she had been in Fort Bridger, so focused on appearances and propriety and maintaining a facade of success. That girl was gone, replaced by a woman who knew the value of honest work, genuine love, and earned prosperity. Lucas returned a few minutes later, reporting that Marcus had simply rolled over in his sleep and was fine. They resumed their positions on the porch, and Tabitha felt Lucas take her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "I want to tell you something," Lucas said. "Something I should have said years ago but did not know how." "What is it?" "That night when I first saw you in Fort Bridger, helping those injured people, I felt something shift inside me. Like I had been waiting my whole life to meet you, and suddenly there you were. I told myself I was just being practical, that we needed help with Sarah and you needed a way out of town. But the truth is, I was already falling in love with you. I just did not know it yet." Tabitha felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears, the kind that came from an overflow of emotion too big to contain. "I fell in love with you the night you trusted me to care for Sarah. You looked at me like I was capable and valuable, not just some decorative thing to be protected and sheltered. That was the moment I knew you were different from every other man I had ever met." "We were lucky to find each other," Lucas said. "No," Tabitha disagreed gently. "Luck is random. What we have, we built. We chose each other, worked for each other, fought for each other. That is not luck. That is love." Lucas pulled her close and kissed her, and Tabitha tasted salt from tears she had not realized were falling. They were tears of joy, of gratitude, of recognition that life could be harsh and unfair, but also unexpectedly beautiful. The years continued to pass, bringing new challenges and new blessings. There was the year of the drought, when they had to haul water from the creek every day to save their crops. There was the winter when Emma got sick with fever and they thought they might lose her, only to have her recover slowly over weeks of careful nursing. There were good years when the harvest was abundant and they could afford luxuries like store-bought fabric and new tools. There were hard years when they barely scraped by and had to make do with what they had. Through it all, they had each other. Tabitha and Lucas raised their children with love and discipline, teaching them the value of hard work and honest dealing. They supported Sarah and James as they started their own family, welcoming nieces and nephews into the growing clan. They became pillars of the small community that gradually formed around Willow Creek, respected for their integrity and their willingness to help neighbors in need. Marcus grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved working alongside his father in the fields. Emma was more adventurous, always climbing trees and exploring the forest, giving her parents constant heart attacks with her fearless nature. They added a third child, another boy they named Thomas, who arrived when Marcus was 8 and Emma was 6. The homestead continued to expand and improve. Lucas built a proper workshop where he could do carpentry and repair work. Tabitha established a more extensive garden, selling excess produce and herbs in Willow Creek to earn extra money. They replaced the original cabin roof with proper shingles, added glass windows instead of oiled paper, and gradually made the place more comfortable and civilized without losing its essential character. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Lucas surprised Tabitha with a gift he had been working on in secret for months. It was a rocking chair, beautifully crafted from polished oak, with intricate carvings along the arms and back. "I wanted you to have something special," he said as she ran her hands over the smooth wood. "Something that is just yours, not for the house or the farm, but for you." Tabitha threw her arms around him, overcome with emotion. It was not an expensive gift by the standards of her old life in Fort Bridger, but it was infinitely more valuable because Lucas had made it himself, had poured his time and skill and love into creating something beautiful for her. She sat in that rocking chair every evening after that, often with one of the children on her lap, watching the sun set over their land and reflecting on how blessed she was. The merchant's daughter, who had lost everything, had found something far more precious than money or status. She had found purpose, love, family, and a home that was truly hers. When Marcus turned 15, he told his parents he wanted to file his own homestead claim someday, to build his own farm the way his father had. Lucas swelled with pride, seeing his son embrace the values and the work ethic he had tried to instill. Emma, at 13, announced she wanted to become a teacher, to help educate the children in the growing community. Thomas, at 7, was still figuring out what he wanted, but he loved animals and spent hours in the barn caring for the livestock. Tabitha looked at her children, these strong, capable young people she and Lucas had raised, and felt a satisfaction that went soul deep. They were good kids, honest and hardworking, with prospects and futures that would be earned rather than inherited through debt and deception. Sarah and James had 4 children of their own by then, and the two families were deeply intertwined, celebrating holidays together, helping with each other's harvests, and supporting each other through difficulties. The original 160 acres had grown to over 300, with James and Sarah claiming adjacent land and building their own successful farm. On a cool autumn evening, when Tabitha was 43 and Lucas was 45, they sat on their porch and watched their grandchildren playing in the yard. Sarah's oldest, a girl named Catherine, was teaching Emma's children a complicated clapping game while the boys threw a ball back and forth. "Can you believe this is our life?" Tabitha asked, leaning into Lucas's embrace. "Sometimes it feels like a dream," Lucas admitted. "Like I am going to wake up and be 18 again, alone and scared with a baby sister to raise and no idea how I was going to manage. But it is not a dream. It is real. We made it real." Lucas kissed the top of her head. "You made it real. You took a chance on a cowboy and his sister, left behind everything you knew and built this life with me. I do not think I ever properly thanked you for that." "You thank me every day," Tabitha said softly. "Every time you hold my hand, every time you make me laugh, every time you show our children what a good man looks like. That is all the thanks I need." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The air smelled of harvest and wood smoke, of apples ripening in the orchard and the rich earth of Montana. It was the smell of home, of belonging, of a life well lived. Tabitha thought about the girl she had been in Fort Bridger, receiving that telegram that destroyed her world. If she could go back and tell that terrified young woman what the future held, she would not believe it. Would not believe that disaster could lead to triumph, that loss could lead to gain, that the end of one life could be the beginning of something infinitely better. "I love you," she whispered to Lucas. "I love you too," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "More every day, if that is even possible." As the stars began to appear overhead, one by one like promises being kept, Tabitha reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The merchant's daughter who lost everything had indeed found everything, just as Lucas had promised all those years ago. But more than that, she had discovered who she truly was beneath the veneer of wealth and status. She was strong, capable, resilient, and worthy of love. The children's laughter echoed across the homestead as twilight deepened into night, and Tabitha smiled. This was her legacy, not the false prosperity of her father's mercantile, but the honest abundance of a life built on love and hard work. These children and grandchildren, this land that bore the mark of their labor, this family that had chosen to stand together through every challenge. Lucas stood and extended his hand to her. "Come to bed, wife. Tomorrow is another day of work." Tabitha took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. "Another day of work," she agreed, "and another day of blessings." They walked into the house together, closing the door on the Montana night. Inside, the fire was burning low in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls they had built with their own hands. This was home. This was family. This was everything that mattered. And as Tabitha lay down beside her husband, feeling his arms wrap around her in the darkness, she offered up a silent prayer of gratitude for the path that had led her here. The path that had begun in loss and ended in love, that had taken the merchant's daughter and transformed her into a woman who knew her own worth, who had earned her place in this world through courage and determination, and the willingness to take a chance on a cowboy's promise. She had lost everything and found everything, and in the finding, she had discovered the truest version of herself. That was a gift more precious than any amount of gold, more valuable than any inheritance, more lasting than any empire built on credit and lies. With Lucas's steady heartbeat beneath her ear and the sounds of their family sleeping safely around them, Tabitha Zimmerman closed her eyes and drifted into peaceful sleep, grateful for every twist of fate that had brought her to this moment, to this life, to this love that would sustain her until her final breath and beyond.